The bitter beginning. Candace Williams had always dreamed of flying. From a young age, she looked up at the sky and imagined herself soaring among the clouds, serving passengers, and living a life of adventure. Growing up in a tight-knit family, Candace's parents instilled in her the values of hard work, perseverance, and the belief that she could achieve anything she set her mind to. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the challenge. When Candace was hired as a stewardess by one of the largest airlines in the country, it felt like her dream had finally come true. The thrill of her first flight, the excitement of meeting new people, and the freedom to travel across the world. It was everything she had ever imagined. But reality soon set in. Candace wasn't just another stewardess. She was one of the very few black women on the team. While most passengers smiled and welcomed her service, there were others who made it clear they didn't see her as an equal. At first, the discrimination was subtle. Comments here and there, whispers behind her back. It wasn't enough to make her want to leave, but it was enough to make her feel like she had to work harder than everyone else to prove herself. When other colleagues were promoted or given more prestigious assignments, Candace had to fight for recognition. It wasn't about her skills. She was an excellent stewardess. But it was about the biases that came with being black in a field dominated by white faces. One afternoon, while serving on a high-profile flight, Candace encountered a situation that would change her life forever. It was a routine first-class service. Candace was prepared, as always. She had ensured that the food was perfect, the drinks were stocked, and the passengers had everything they needed. Everything was running smoothly until she approached a wealthy businessman sitting in the front row. She greeted him with a smile, offering him a drink. The man, a middle-aged man in a sharp suit, barely looked up from his phone. His cold eyes scanned her face briefly before he made a comment that froze Candace in her tracks. "I don't feel comfortable with you serving me," he said, barely glancing at her. Candace's heart sank. She had dealt with microaggressions before, but this felt different, open, explicit. She straightened up, forcing a polite smile. "I'm sorry, sir. Is there something wrong with the service?" The man looked up then, meeting her gaze with a sneer. "I don't want a black woman handling my food. You can get someone else." Candace stood still, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had been a professional, always going above and beyond for every passenger. But here she was, being rejected because of the color of her skin. Before she could respond, the businessman snapped his fingers, calling over the flight supervisor. "Sir, I would prefer not to have this woman serve me," he said with an air of superiority. "I'll be more comfortable if she's replaced." The flight supervisor, a man Candace had worked with for months, glanced at her, then at the passenger, and without hesitation, nodded. "I'll have you reassigned, Candace. Please, step aside." Candace's chest tightened as she watched the supervisor turn away. It was happening. Again. The familiar sting of injustice shot through her, but she held her composure. She knew that making the scene wouldn't change anything, at least not in that moment. She left the first-class cabin quietly, escorted off the flight like a criminal. The official reason: she was unfit to serve that particular passenger. She knew what had really happened, but the airline had turned a blind eye to the racism that had plagued her since day one. It was no longer just a momentary humiliation. It was a clear-cut case of racial discrimination, and Candace was the victim. As she stepped off the plane, Candace felt her world unraveling. She had spent years building her career, pouring her heart and soul into a job she loved, only to be torn down because of something she couldn't change. Her colleagues didn't seem to care, and the passengers. They would never know the truth. The system that was supposed to protect her had failed her, and now all she had left was the cold, bitter taste of defeat. Candace's dismissal spread like wildfire. The media ran stories about the airline's latest controversy, but they never quite told the whole story. Most people saw a stewardess who was simply unfit for the job, but Candace knew the real reason. Racism had reared its ugly head again. She took legal action against the airline, but the legal battles drained her. Emotionally, financially, and mentally, she fought for justice, but the system wasn't kind to people like her. Time and again, the courts sided with the airline. Eventually, she had to accept that her fight for justice wasn't going to be won in a courtroom. But Candace wasn't the type to back down. As the years passed, she took her case to the people. She became an advocate for workplace discrimination, speaking out at rallies, writing articles, and engaging with communities that shared her struggles. She didn't just want justice for herself. She wanted to make sure that no one else would have to endure the same treatment she had. During this time, Candace made an important decision. She wasn't going to let the airline define her. She went back to school, earning her MBA, and began working for organizations that fought for workplace equality. Her story became one of resilience, a beacon of hope for people who had been overlooked, misjudged, and mistreated. As Candace rebuilt her life, the scars from the past never completely faded, but they no longer controlled her. Instead, they had become the foundation for a future that was bigger and brighter than she could have ever imagined. Little did she know, the airline that had once cast her aside would soon become the very platform for her greatest comeback. The world wasn't ready for what was coming, and Candace Williams was about to show them all just how powerful a person could become when they refused to let the past dictate their future. Rising from the ashes. Years passed since Candace Williams had been escorted off that flight. What began as a humiliating moment had evolved into a lifelong battle. Candace had turned her pain into fuel, using every rejection and every setback as a stepping stone towards something greater. The airline that had once discarded her, the industry that had failed to recognize her worth, now seemed like distant memories. Yet Candace knew that her journey was far from over. It was just beginning. She had become an icon of resilience, a voice for those who had been silenced by the system. But Candace didn't want to be just a symbol. She wanted to change the system itself. She had learned that one could only be truly free when they stopped waiting for others to give them a chance and started creating their own opportunities. After the legal battles and the exhausting years of fighting for recognition, Candace felt like she had nothing left to lose. The corporate world, much like the airline industry, was a place where barriers were high, especially for women of color. But Candace was no stranger to adversity, and adversity had shaped her into something stronger than she had ever imagined. She returned to school, earning an MBA with distinction, driven by the belief that education was the key to unlocking doors that society had once closed to her. While attending business school, Candace found herself drawn to leadership. It wasn't just about business tactics or profitability. It was about creating systems that worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. Candace had always believed in the power of diversity, inclusion, and fairness, and now she had the knowledge to implement it. She began seeking out companies with strong diversity programs, wanting to work for a place that shared her vision. But even in her new role as a corporate consultant, Candace could never quite shake the feeling that her work, though meaningful, was still small compared to the larger changes she wanted to make. In the meantime, the airline she had once worked for was struggling. Its reputation was tarnished by ongoing scandals, accusations of systemic racism, and mounting pressure from public outcry. It wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a crisis of trust. Customers were leaving in droves, and employees were fed up with the toxic culture that pervaded the company. Something had to change, and the higher-ups knew it. They needed someone who could turn things around, someone who could rebuild the company's image and lead it into a new era. They needed someone who had faced the very problems they were now trying to solve. But no one could have predicted the person they would turn to. Candace had moved on from the idea of returning to the airline. She was successful, making a name for herself as a consultant and an advocate for change. She was working with tech companies, nonprofits, and startups, helping them build more inclusive and fair workplaces. Her work was starting to gain national attention, and Candace had begun to speak at large conferences about the importance of diversity in business. She had found her voice, not just as a leader, but as an advocate for the voiceless. It was during one of these speaking engagements that she received an unexpected call. "Candace, we need you," the voice on the other end said. It was an executive from the airline, the same one that had fired her all those years ago. Candace felt her pulse quicken. She had heard rumors about the company's internal struggles, but never expected to be contacted directly. "We need someone who understands what it's like to be overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. Someone who knows what it takes to turn a company around," the executive continued. "We need you to come back as CEO." At first, Candace thought it was a joke. It had to be. This was the same airline that had fired her based on a racist complaint, the same company that had humiliated her in front of passengers and colleagues. But as the conversation continued, she realized they weren't joking. The airline, battered by years of controversy and negative press, was ready for a change. They wanted someone who could not only manage the crisis, but could change the very culture that had allowed racism and discrimination to thrive within the company. The idea was ludicrous. Why would Candace, after all she had gone through, even consider working for the same airline that had discarded her so easily? But as the offer sank in, Candace started to see an opportunity. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making them pay for the pain they had caused her. It was about making real, lasting change. It was about showing the world that the past didn't define her. And it didn't have to define the airline either. Candace agreed to meet with the board of directors. She came prepared, as she always did. She had no intention of simply taking the job. She wanted to understand the company's vision and what they were truly willing to do to make things right. She wasn't going to be just another token hire to check off a diversity box. She was Candace Williams, and if she were going to step back into this world, it would be on her terms. The meeting was intense. The executives, some of whom had been with the company for decades, were nervous. They were looking for someone who could speak the language of leadership, someone who could transform their tarnished brand into a symbol of innovation and inclusion. Candace was not the woman they had once rejected. She had become a force to be reckoned with, an expert in corporate culture, a trailblazer in advocating for social justice. And yet, as she sat across from the board members, Candace couldn't help but think back to that day when she had been escorted off the plane. She remembered the looks on the faces of her colleagues, the shame that weighed on her as she was removed from the flight, and the deep, gut-wrenching feeling that something had been taken from her that could never be restored. It was that feeling that propelled her forward, driving her to use this new position as a means to right the wrongs of her past. "I'm not here to settle old scores," Candace told them firmly. "But I am here to make sure that what happened to me, what happened to so many others, is never allowed to happen again. If you want me to lead this company, it's going to take more than just a new face. It's going to take a complete transformation." The executives nodded, fully aware of the magnitude of the task ahead. And so, Candace took the job. Candace's return to the airline was nothing short of revolutionary. The news spread like wildfire, creating a ripple effect across the corporate world. Many viewed it as a tale of sweet redemption, while others saw it as a sign that real change was finally within reach. Candace Williams wasn't just returning to an old job, she was returning to rewrite history. Her first task as CEO was clear: dismantle the toxic culture that had plagued the airline for years. From day one, Candace made it known that there would be no room for complacency. She began by addressing the employees, holding town hall meetings, and speaking directly to those who had been silenced for far too long. She listened to their stories of mistreatment, racism, and inequality. She promised them that their voices would be heard. Candace also made significant changes to the company's policies, implementing diversity and inclusion programs that would change the very fabric of the organization. She introduced mandatory unconscious bias training, revamped the recruitment process to ensure equal opportunities for all candidates, and worked closely with HR to ensure that employees were supported in reporting any form of discrimination. It wasn't easy. Resistance was fierce, especially among senior executives who had been with the company for decades. But Candace was relentless. She knew that true change wasn't about appeasing the old guard. It was about creating a future where every employee, regardless of their background, could feel valued and respected. The challenges were many, but Candace faced each one head-on. It wasn't just about restoring the airline's reputation. It was about transforming it into a place that reflected the values she had fought for all her life: fairness, equality, and respect. And with every step forward, Candace proved that the very same company that had once broken her could now be the one that helped heal the wounds of others. But the road to redemption had only just begun. The unseen battles. Candace Williams stood at the helm of an empire, a position few had imagined her reaching, and fewer still had thought she could handle. But every corner of her being screamed that this was not the end. This was only the beginning of the real work. There were scars, both personal and institutional, that needed to be addressed, and Candace was committed to healing them. The battles were no longer about personal redemption. They were about a profound shift in the very heart of the company, and eventually, an entire industry. The first few months were a whirlwind. Candace threw herself into her role with the same intensity that had driven her through years of adversity. Every department was scrutinized, every policy examined. The airline's diversity programs, previously no more than corporate lip service, were overhauled. Candace's goals were clear: rebuild the company's image, restore its reputation, and most importantly, make it a model for inclusivity and equality. But she knew that none of this could be achieved by sweeping the past under the rug. The airline had to confront its history head-on. Candace started by addressing the company's leadership structure. She recognized that true change wouldn't come from the bottom up. It had to come from the top down. Senior executives, many of whom had been entrenched in the old ways for decades, would have to align with her vision, or they would have to go. Her first major move was the dismissal of several key figures in the management team who had been resistant to change or had been complicit in perpetuating the toxic culture of the past. This wasn't a decision Candace made lightly. She had known these executives for years, and some of them had been friends. But the reality was stark. The company's survival depended on dismantling the structures that had upheld a culture of discrimination, subtle or otherwise. It was the beginning of the hardest part of her job, facing the very people who had previously supported her, only to watch them slowly unravel as they realized they no longer had the power they once held. It was a lesson Candace had learned through her own experience. Leadership isn't about making friends. Leadership is about doing what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. As she slowly began to replace the old guard with individuals who understood her vision for inclusivity, the pressure mounted. The company's stock prices, which had initially taken a nosedive after her hiring, now seemed to level off, but only because the true depth of the changes hadn't yet been felt. The hardest battles, Candace realized, were the unseen ones, the small daily moments of resistance that no one talked about in the boardroom. There were passive-aggressive comments in meetings, backhanded compliments from employees who didn't believe in her leadership, and subtle sabotage from people within the company who resented her power. At one point, during an executive meeting, Candace was met with a question that felt like a direct challenge to her authority. "Do you think your personal story is enough to change this company?" It came from one of the vice presidents, someone who had been with the company for over 20 years. The question wasn't just about her qualifications. It was about her identity, her past, and the underlying assumption that someone like Candace, someone who had endured so much discrimination, could never be truly effective as a leader. Candace could feel the air thicken, the subtle challenge in the room. There was an almost audible silence as everyone awaited her response. For a moment, Candace considered her options. She could have responded defensively, could have retorted with an insult or an outburst. But she had learned long ago that reacting emotionally only gave others the ammunition they needed to undermine her. Instead, Candace leaned forward, her gaze steady. "It's not just my story," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "It's everyone's story. The difference is that I'm here to make sure we stop telling people's stories in silence. I'm here to make sure that every person who's been overlooked, underestimated, or silenced has a seat at the table, and their voices heard loud and clear. "My story doesn't define my ability to lead. My vision does." It was a turning point. That one statement, made with quiet authority, was a wake-up call to everyone in the room. Some of the executives sat in stunned silence. Others tried to brush it off. But Candace knew that the message had landed. Leadership was no longer about titles and resumes. It was about vision, purpose, and unwavering integrity. Despite her success in the boardroom, the workplace culture still felt like a battlefield. Candace had to be meticulous in handling the smallest nuances of office politics, the casual jokes at her expense, the raised eyebrows when she suggested new ideas, the constant microaggressions that chipped away at her confidence. And while she remained focused on her mission, there was still a part of her that longed for validation. She had never asked for sympathy, but a part of her hoped that after everything she had endured, the respect of her colleagues would come naturally. But as Candace soon realized, respect wasn't given. It had to be earned again and again, each time someone tried to break her down. There were still moments when she doubted herself, when the weight of the company's history threatened to crush her spirit. There were nights she spent staring at the city skyline from her office, wondering if all the effort was worth it. One night, after a particularly grueling board meeting, Candace retreated to her office. She needed space, silence, and clarity. As she sat at her desk, a small framed photo caught her eye. It was a picture of her young daughter, who had been her rock throughout this entire journey. Candace had always kept her family close, drawing strength from them during the darkest moments. Looking at the photo, she realized that the battles she faced were not just for herself. They were for everyone who had come before her and everyone who would come after. The next morning, Candace made a decision that would forever change the company. She called a company-wide meeting, a meeting that wasn't just about a new policy or a new initiative, but about a complete cultural reset. She understood that diversity and inclusion weren't just buzzwords. They were values that had to be embodied at every level of the company. It wasn't enough to create a few programs and expect the changes to be felt. She needed to ensure that the company's culture reflected those values at every touchpoint. In the meeting, Candace spoke from the heart. She didn't sugarcoat the challenges ahead or pretend that change was easy. She admitted that there would be pushback, and that the path to true equality and inclusion was long and difficult. But she also reminded everyone that the purpose of the airline was not just to serve customers, it was to serve its people. "We're all part of something much bigger than just this company," she said, her voice strong. "We're part of a movement to make the workplace a place where everyone, regardless of their background, can thrive. If we want to be leaders in the industry, we must first be leaders in how we treat each other." That meeting marked the beginning of Candace's most ambitious plan yet, a comprehensive overhaul of the airline's internal culture. She introduced a new mentorship program for underrepresented employees, created open forums for discussing issues of discrimination and bias, and ensured that every level of the company was accountable to the same high standards of respect and integrity. It was bold, it was risky, and it was exactly what the airline needed. Candace knew that even as the company began to shift, the real test of her leadership would be when things got difficult. She would have to confront more resistance, face more failures, and navigate the same old system that had nearly destroyed her. But now, she had the tools, the resolve, and the heart to overcome whatever came her way. As she looked out the window of her office that day, Candace smiled. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she had finally begun to walk the path that would transform not just the airline, but an entire industry. The roots of change. Candace Williams had already been through the hardest parts of her journey, surviving the corporate world's toxic culture, being fired in a moment of racial prejudice, and returning to take control of the very company that had once discarded her. Yet, in many ways, her real work had just begun. To change an institution as massive and entrenched as a major airline was no small feat, and Candace knew she needed to stay vigilant. There was a long road ahead, one filled with challenges she had not even begun to imagine. And yet, despite all the obstacles, Candace was resolute. She would be the one to break the cycle of injustice and lay the foundation for a future where her children and every other person of color could thrive. Her first few months as CEO had been a whirlwind of strategic meetings, decision-making, and policy shifts. But as Candace soon realized, the outward changes, though necessary, were not enough. True transformation required a deep, systemic overhaul. It required a change in mindset, an internal shift in how people viewed diversity, race, and opportunity within the company. The first major initiative Candace launched was an internal listening campaign, a bold move, especially for a new CEO. She didn't just want to impose her vision from the top down. Candace understood that leadership, especially in a company like hers, had to be a dialogue. And for that, she needed to hear the voices of every employee from the ground up. Through town halls, employee surveys, and one-on-one meetings, Candace made it clear that this was not a token gesture. She wanted the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. For weeks, she sat through session after session, listening to employees from every corner of the company share their experiences. And what she heard shocked her. There were stories of racial discrimination, subtle and overt, dating back years. There were employees who had been passed over for promotions, not because they lacked the qualifications, but because of their race. Others had faced microaggressions on a daily basis, where their ideas were dismissed, their abilities questioned, and their accomplishments overlooked. Some spoke of their fear of speaking up, knowing the repercussions could cost them their jobs or their reputations. Candace had heard these stories before, but never from so many voices at once. It was a wake-up call. The airline's problems were more ingrained than she had realized. The systemic barriers were vast, and Candace needed a strategy that addressed them at every level. But Candace wasn't one to retreat into despair. She saw the listening campaign not as a collection of grievances, but as a treasure trove of insights that would guide her as she built a new foundation for the company. She began by reshaping the leadership team. The old guard had been a product of the company's outdated culture, and Candace knew that in order to create a truly inclusive environment, she needed leaders who shared her vision. Slowly, she started recruiting a new generation of executives, people who were not only skilled but who also understood the importance of diversity and inclusion. She brought in experts in corporate ethics, human resources, and culture transformation. Individuals who were ready to do the hard work of challenging biases and dismantling the invisible barriers that had kept people of color from rising through the ranks. Candace didn't just change policies. She changed the way the company operated on a fundamental level. She implemented new recruitment practices that specifically targeted diverse candidates, not just in entry-level positions, but across all levels of the organization. She made sure that leadership roles were filled with individuals who had demonstrated a commitment to fairness, inclusion, and representation. It wasn't just about meeting diversity quotas. It was about making sure that diverse voices were not just heard, but actively shaped the direction of the company. But Candace knew that no amount of policy changes would truly make a difference unless the entire company was on board. She began to focus on the cultural transformation that needed to take place within every team. She launched a mandatory diversity and inclusion training program for all employees, executives included. The training was intense, confronting people with their own biases, helping them understand how those biases impacted their decision-making and behavior. Some employees bristled at the new policies, resistant to what they saw as political correctness or an overreaction. But Candace remained firm. She knew that this discomfort was part of the process of growth. One of the biggest challenges Candace faced was changing the minds of the company's longtime passengers, those loyal customers who had been with the airline for years and who didn't always understand the need for these changes. They were used to the status quo, accustomed to the airline's culture and its implicit biases. Candace needed to get them on board, and she knew it would take more than a marketing campaign to shift their perspectives. She began by using the airline's own platforms, its advertising, its social media presence, and its in-flight experience to send a clear message. The airline was no longer just a company. It was a reflection of the diverse world in which we live. She launched campaigns highlighting stories of employees from all backgrounds, showing them not just as workers but as people with rich lives, talents, and dreams. She featured flight attendants, ground staff, pilots, and even maintenance workers, giving them a platform to share their stories. These weren't just generic success stories. They were powerful narratives of overcoming adversity, of resilience, and of the value of diversity in making the company stronger. Her efforts were met with some resistance. Some customers canceled their flights, and social media platforms became battlegrounds where her leadership was critiqued. But Candace wasn't deterred. She understood that change rarely comes without growing pains, and she was prepared for the backlash. The airline's reputation was at stake, and Candace knew that making it a beacon of diversity and inclusion was the right path, even if it was a long uphill climb. What Candace hadn't anticipated, however, was the growing support from unexpected quarters. Civil rights organizations, advocacy groups, and even former employees who had once left the company because of its toxic culture began to rally behind her. Slowly, public opinion began to shift in her favor, as people recognized that Candace wasn't just making the company more profitable, she was making it more humane. In one of the most significant moments of her tenure, Candace was invited to speak at a global conference on corporate responsibility. It was an event that brought together CEOs and leaders from some of the world's most powerful corporations, and Candace knew it was an opportunity to further her message. The stakes were high. Would the world see her as just another CEO? Or would they see the leader who was pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a responsible corporate citizen? The conference was filled with the typical corporate rhetoric, talk of profits, growth, and competition. But when Candace took the stage, the room fell silent. She wasn't there to talk about financials or market strategies. She was there to talk about something far more important: human dignity. She began by sharing her story, not as a tale of personal suffering, but as a call to action. She spoke about the systemic racism that had plagued the airline industry and the responsibility that companies had to actively combat it. She didn't just talk about the need for diversity. She made a compelling case for why diversity was essential to the future of business. We cannot separate business success from social responsibility, she told the room, her voice steady and clear. True success is not about numbers on a balance sheet. It's about creating a culture where every person, no matter their background, has an opportunity to succeed. The room erupted into applause. It wasn't the typical applause one might expect from a corporate speech. This wasn't a speech about profit margins or new products. It was a speech that challenged the very foundation of corporate culture. And it was a message Candace had spent years working toward. But as she left the stage that day, Candace knew that the real work wasn't in the applause. It was in the continued push for change. She had taken the first step, but there was still so much more to do. She was building a new legacy, not just for her company, but for the entire industry. With each passing day, Candace proved that leadership wasn't about titles or personal gain. It was about creating a culture of fairness, equality, and respect for all. The roots of change had been planted, and they were beginning to take hold in ways no one could have predicted. The breaking point. Candace Williams had spent years battling the forces that had once tried to silence her. Now, as the CEO of the airline, she faced the most daunting challenge yet: ensuring that the change she had started would not only survive, but thrive in a system that was still deeply rooted in its old ways. She had already dismantled barriers at the corporate level, but it became increasingly clear to Candace that there were forces within the company, quiet but powerful, that weren't ready to let go of the past. The resistance was subtle at first. There were hushed conversations in the hallways, veiled criticisms in board meetings, and the occasional slip-up from middle management. For every policy Candace enacted to promote diversity and inclusion, there seemed to be an undercurrent of opposition that whispered in the background. And these weren't just the disgruntled voices of old-timers who resented the changes. They were people who, on the surface, seemed committed to the company's new direction. people who held positions of influence. One morning, Candace received an anonymous letter in her office. It was a thinly veiled threat, claiming that the changes she was pushing for would ruin the company. The letter's author warned that they would do whatever it took to undermine her efforts. This wasn't the first time Candace had received such messages, but this one felt different, more calculated, more personal. The letter was a warning, but Candace wasn't one to back down from threats. She had faced far worse in her life, but the constant pressure was taking a toll. Every day felt like a battle on two fronts: the external pressures of transforming an entire corporation, and the internal, unspoken war against the forces of complacency and fear of change. Candace could feel herself becoming more isolated. Her early days as CEO had been filled with enthusiasm and hope. But now, every decision seemed to carry the weight of the world. It was no longer about just making change. It was about surviving it. Candace's fears were soon realized when one of her closest allies in the company, a young executive named Michael Edwards, was found to have been leaking sensitive information about the company's internal diversity initiatives to the press. The leaks were damaging. They painted her efforts as political correctness gone too far, and implied that the company's profits were suffering as a result. The story ran on multiple news outlets, and the backlash was immediate. Michael had been one of Candace's strongest supporters, someone she trusted to carry out her vision. But now he was at the center of a scandal that threatened to undo everything she had worked for. Candace was forced to take swift action. She called Michael into her office, and though she had always prided herself on being compassionate, this was different. She could see the guilt in his eyes, but also the fear. She had no doubt that he was being pressured, perhaps even blackmailed, but she couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. "Michael, I gave you this opportunity because I believed in you," Candace said, her voice tight but controlled. "But what you've done here is unforgivable. You've undermined everything this company stands for." Michael opened his mouth to protest, but Candace raised a hand. "No excuses. You put us all in danger. You've given our enemies the ammunition they need to discredit me, and everything we've worked so hard to build. I can't allow this to go on any longer." The silence in the room was deafening. Michael's face was pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room, as if seeking a way out. Candace felt a pang of regret, but she pushed it aside. She knew what had to be done. "I'm sorry, Michael, but I'm terminating your contract effective immediately. I hope you understand why." The words were final, and there was no room for debate. Michael nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. He knew this was coming. Candace had been firm, but even as she gave the order, she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that gnawed at her. Michael had been a symbol of the new generation of leaders she had been trying to build. He had been her ally. And now his actions had put everything at risk. The fallout was immediate and intense. The press ran stories questioning her leadership, wondering if she had been too ambitious in pushing her diversity agenda. Critics suggested that her decision to terminate Michael was an overreaction, and that the company had simply been too quick to jump on the diversity bandwagon. Even some of her own employees, those who had once supported her, began to voice doubts. It wasn't just the old guard that was resisting change. It was the people who had once believed in her, the ones who had hoped her vision would lead to a more inclusive, progressive workplace. Candace spent the next few weeks in a whirlwind of meetings, trying to restore confidence in her leadership. But it was clear that the damage had been done. The cracks were beginning to show. There were whispers in the hallways about whether Candace could handle the pressure of running such a large and complex organization, especially with the constant media scrutiny. The emotional toll on Candace was immense, and she found herself questioning everything she had worked for. But even as she grappled with the weight of her decisions, something unexpected happened. The employees who had once been silent began to speak up, not just about the issues Candace had addressed, but about the deeper problems within the company. Candace had expected resistance, but she hadn't anticipated the outpouring of support from some of the most unlikely quarters. A flight attendant named Jasmine, who had been with the company for over 20 years, stood up at one of the town halls and shared her story of being passed over for promotions and ignored in favor of less qualified candidates. Her voice broke with emotion as she spoke of the countless times she had been told that she was too much, too vocal, too ambitious, too difficult to be considered for leadership positions. Jasmine's testimony resonated deeply with many of the other employees, particularly the women and people of color who had long felt sidelined by the company's old culture. Jasmine's bravery inspired others to come forward, and soon more employees were sharing their stories of exclusion, marginalization, and inequity. What Candace had initially feared would be the downfall of her leadership, the backlash, and the scandal was, in fact, turning into a rallying cry for change. In the midst of the chaos, Candace realized something crucial. The battle wasn't about proving her vision was right to the outside world. It was about proving it to her own employees. The only way forward was to double down on the work she had started. The company needed to see that she was not just a figurehead. They needed to know she was fully committed to the journey, no matter how difficult it was. She called for an emergency board meeting, determined to regain control. The room was tense, with many board members still reeling from the public fallout. But Candace stood before them, unwavering. She reminded them that the stakes were higher than profits or public opinion. The future of the company, the lives of the employees, and the moral responsibility they all shared were more important than any immediate setbacks. "We have a choice," she said, her voice steady. "We can let fear and resistance dictate our future, or we can embrace the opportunity to be the leaders of the future. We can show the world that we are more than just a company. We are a force for good. I will not back down. And neither should any of you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, the board members began to nod in agreement. Candace knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a spark of hope. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges were far from over. But Candace Williams had already shown that she was not a leader who would bend to the forces of injustice. No matter how hard the journey became, she knew one thing for sure. She would never stop fighting for the future she believed in. The final battle. The months that followed Candace's dramatic call for change felt like a battle of endurance. Every day was a test, and every decision a potential inflection point. Despite the newfound support from her employees and the growing wave of public backing, Candace knew that her fight was far from over. The company's culture was entrenched in ways that could not be uprooted overnight. She had pushed for transparency, for fairness, for inclusion, but the resistance she faced wasn't just on the outside. It was woven into the very fabric of the airline itself. Behind closed doors, Candace began to notice something troubling. There were individuals on the executive team who had been quietly undermining her efforts. These were people who had once publicly pledged allegiance to her vision, but now, in private meetings, were hinting that perhaps the company's transformation was too fast and too radical. They suggested that Candace's leadership style, while admirable, was pushing the company into dangerous territory. More often than not, these individuals were the same ones who had benefited from the old system, people who were comfortable with things as they were. Candace understood that they feared change, feared losing their privileged positions, and feared the implications of a company that truly lived by its new values. One afternoon, Candace received an invitation for a closed-door meeting with the board of directors. There was no explanation in the message, but she knew something was brewing. Over the past few weeks, a group of board members had been quietly circulating a petition to evaluate her leadership. The Whisper campaign had gained traction, and now they were calling it an intervention to ensure the future of the company. Candace knew this was their way of trying to push her out. Doubt was creeping in, and she was being cornered. As she walked into the meeting room, she could feel the cold tension in the air. The group was sitting around a long mahogany table, their faces neutral but their eyes guarded. Candace took her seat at the head of the table, her usual confidence slightly shaken but still resolute. She had faced worse. This wasn't a battle she had not seen before. But this time, the stakes were much higher. One of the senior board members, Andrew Fields, was the first to speak. He was a veteran of the airline industry, a man whose views on leadership were steeped in traditional practices. His voice was calm but firm as he addressed Candace. "Candace," Andrew began, his words carefully measured, "we all respect what you've done for this company. The diversity initiatives, the emphasis on inclusion, it's admirable. But the reality is, the public backlash is growing. The company's profits are stagnating. You've alienated a significant portion of our customer base. We need to take a step back and reassess if this vision can really work." Candace felt the sharpness of his words, but she was prepared. She had been hearing similar arguments for months. What bothered her wasn't the fact that they were questioning her vision. It was that they were framing it as a failure before giving it a chance to succeed. "I've spent the last year working tirelessly to ensure this company reflects the values that it should. Values of equality, respect, and opportunity," Candace replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "I won't apologize for that. And I won't back down just because the road is difficult." Andrew's expression hardened. "It's not about apologizing, Candace. It's about results. And right now, the company is at a crossroads. We need someone with more experience, someone who understands the balance between innovation and tradition." Candace's heart sank for a moment. She knew what that meant. It was a coded way of saying they wanted someone who would continue business as usual, someone who wouldn't rock the boat, someone who wouldn't challenge the status quo. "And who do you have in mind?" Candace asked, her voice steady, but the edges of her anger just barely concealed. Before anyone could answer, Candace took a deep breath, fighting to maintain her composure. She wasn't surprised by the lack of support, but she refused to let them see her sweat. This wasn't the first time people had tried to undermine her, and it wouldn't be the last. "Let me make one thing clear," Candace continued, locking eyes with each of the board members. "I'm not here for tradition. I'm here to create something that lasts. This company doesn't need another CEO who only wants to fill seats and make profits. This company needs a leader who is willing to take the hard steps to change the future, for all of us. And that means moving beyond comfort zones, beyond the familiar, and embracing the uncomfortable truth that we can do better." The room fell silent. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. For a moment, Candace wasn't sure if anyone would respond. But then, to her surprise, one of the junior board members, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, spoke up. Sarah had been one of Candace's strongest allies since her return. She was a recent hire, a diversity advocate who had risen through the ranks in the past year. Sarah's voice was soft but firm as she addressed the room. "I don't think it's right to dismiss Candace now. She's leading us through one of the hardest transitions this company has ever faced. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, we've lost customers. But look at the bigger picture. Look at what we're gaining. Real change. Employees are speaking out. We're starting to build a culture where people feel heard, valued, and included. If we abandon that now, if we let Candace go, we risk losing everything we've worked for." The room shifted. Sarah's words had cut through the tension like a knife. It wasn't the most radical argument. It wasn't even the most eloquent. But it was honest, and it struck a chord. Candace could feel the room changing. There was no guarantee that she would win this battle, but she knew now that she wasn't alone. The shift had already begun. There were more allies in the room than she had initially realized. Andrew Fields, still holding the majority of the board's influence, spoke again, his tone less certain than before. "I hear what you're saying, Sarah, but we need results. We need to see something concrete that proves these changes are working." Candace knew what he meant. He wanted proof that the company's vision would be more than just a progressive ideal. He wanted numbers, data, metrics, and she could give him that. "We've already started collecting data on employee satisfaction and retention," Candace said, her voice now sharper, more decisive. "The numbers speak for themselves. Our turnover rates have dropped significantly. Employees are staying longer, feeling more connected to the company. Our diversity training programs have reduced complaints about discrimination by 40% in the past 6 months. It's working. Slowly, but it's working. The board members exchanged looks. Andrew remained silent, but Candace could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Sarah's words, combined with the undeniable proof Candace had presented, had begun to shift the conversation. "This isn't just about numbers," Candace said, her eyes scanning the room. "It's about the future. It's about the kind of company we want to be. A company that values integrity, that leads by example, and that stands up for what's right. I won't apologize for pushing the envelope. I'll continue to fight for what this company can and should be." The silence stretched on for several long moments. And then, unexpectedly, Andrew spoke again, his tone less firm but more resigned. "All right, Candace. You've made your point. We'll give you more time to prove this vision. But understand that the pressure is on. If this doesn't work, we'll have to reconsider your position." Candace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't a complete victory. She still had much to prove. But for now, she had won the fight. The battle wasn't over, but she had earned the opportunity to continue her work. As the meeting broke up, Candace left the room with a sense of cautious optimism. The war for the company's soul was far from won, but she was no longer fighting it alone. And that was the first step toward victory. She had turned the tide. Now, all she had to do was keep pushing forward.